So welcome everyone. My name is Derek Carpel. I'm a client relations manager here at K.I.G Property Management, and I want to welcome you all to today's webinar, Turning Tenant Scaries into Tenant Treats, the treat of rule respecting tenants. I'm joined by my co-host and CEO of K.I.G Property Management, Jared Carpel. Jared, why don't you say hello to everyone?
Hello, everybody. Jared Carpel, CEO of K.I.G Property Management, real estate lawyer as well, broker, and general contractor. We've been in the business for about 15, 16 years. So we kind of have an understanding of really these tricky tenant scenarios. So I think it's a perfect time for us to be going through this through the Halloween time of year.
Nothing says spooky tenants or Halloween like spooky tenants, I should say. So, all right. Well, we've got a jam-packed schedule, a lot of good information filled with like real life stories and situations that we've experienced over the past decade and a half or so of being in business. But more importantly, how I think we can help you, whether you are a single family homeowner with just one tenant, or if you manage a multitude of properties throughout your portfolio. I think these are really good tips and tricks that we can assist you with. So let's get started. So this is coming from the perspective of being a tenant is very simple, okay? The bottom line is tenants have three rules that they need to abide by. Pay rent full and on time, respect the property, and respect the neighbors, right? It's very, very simple. That's pretty much what we really require from our tenants. But then again, we get some spooky tenants that we can't really control. And the problem these days is that there are a lot of rules and regulations that many tenants just ignore. There's widespread delinquency. I recently read a report from the University of Pennsylvania that about 100,000 to 155,000 households are behind on rent. And there's a ton of misinformation, Jared, as you know. With social media now, everybody's a landlord and tenant lawyer. Everyone's a real estate expert. And so they're using ChatGPT and TikTok to help educate themselves on understanding the law, even though they're very much incorrect. And they often use that information against landlords that really kind of help, really second guess landlords.
And I think that's the value that I think, Derek, we bring, being both lawyers. When clients come to us and they say, "Oh, a tenant has told us X, Y, and Z. We have violated their rights," and of course, the tenants are being informed by ChatGPT or TikTok. They come to us, and we're able to lower the temperature and bring in the confidence of the law behind us to set the right expectations in the relationship and rebalance the relationship between the landlord and the tenant.
And I think it's particularly helpful. I agree with you 100%. And I think now that there's so many more legal protections for tenants, that can really be a little confusing at times. Obviously, we want protection for tenants, but a lot of them can be very confusing and really can help strain, or I should say help strain. They do strain relationships between ownership and tenants. And I think it's helpful having a legal background like us to be able to help interpret some of the laws that are coming out. And in reality, they're just constant lease violations. We're seeing it with rent payments, with sometimes destruction of property, and just tenants in general just not respecting the quiet enjoyment of their communities that they live in. So we can't really control spooky tenants, right? But I think what we can do is influence tenant behavior. And the big question is when a tenant does violate a lease, do we respond with patience and understanding, or are they out of second chances? Can we use treats? Can we incentivize cooperation, use positive reinforcement to get tenants back in compliance? Or do we need a little bit of a trick here to really enforce discipline? So how can we really make sure that we're balancing between the tricks and treats that we see? And I think that the successful approach to property management is really knowing when to extend that grace and knowing when to enforce consequences. So in the theme of Halloween, we're going to talk about the rules, talking about paying rent full on time, respecting the property, respecting your neighbors, and when do we see tenant tricks and when do we see tenant treats and how we need to respond to them. So Jared, I want to quickly talk to us, why is paying rent full on time and what are the expectations that tenants that we have for tenants when it comes to paying rent?
Yeah, so rule number one, tenants have to pay rent in full on time. And you mentioned, by the way, before I jump into this, you mentioned we have three rules, right? Granted, our leases and all the addendums and all the disclosures that California law makes us do with tenants, our leases can be 100 pages long and we're electronically, signing them, et cetera. But those 100 pages really come down to these three basic rules that we've created over the years, right? Paying the rent in full on time, respect the property, respect the quiet enjoyment of their neighbors. But as it pertains to kind of paying rent in full on time, rent by law, doesn't matter what your lease says, by law, rent is due in the first. And then you can offer a grace period, and we offer a grace period through the third, excuse me. Um, and the idea here, the reason why it's so important to have rent being paid in full and on time, aside from the fact that collections efforts can be very time consuming and costly, but the landlord and the owner of the property has other financial obligations that they have a timeline and they're up against. For example, they have to pay their mortgage. They can't contact the bank and say, "I'm sorry, I'm not paying the mortgage this month because my tenant got into a car accident and pay rent." That doesn't fly. And not to mention, another perfect example is even though no matter how much rent comes through the door, the landlord is still responsible for making maintenance requests, for handling maintenance and repairs, and ensuring that the property still operates in a healthy and safe manner for its residents. So, regardless of when rent comes in. So, those are kind of two big reasons why rent paid in full on time is important. So, um, really, what we try to do, and there are instances where tenants run into some challenges, and we'll allow partial payments as long as they're on an agreed upon payment plan. And we'll talk more about that in the coming slides. We accept all forms, well, most forms of payments for rent. We have an online portal allowing our tenants to pay their rent via ACH or credit card. A lot of our tenants, in fact, overwhelming amount of our tenants migrated to an online platform. We also allow our tenants, it's called pay slips, allows them, if they have a QR code, which they get through our office, they can walk into a 7-Eleven, a Walgreens, a CVS, and they show that barcode, excuse me, to the cash register person, and they can pay their rent at those places, and it automatically gets paid into our account. You could pay via cashier's check, money order. We don't do Venmo. We don't do Zelle, PayPal. We prefer not to have personal checks, although sometimes we do accept them depending upon the creditworthiness of the tenant. But ultimately, as I mentioned kind of earlier, and Derek, you're summarizing here, respecting these due dates of rents is really important because late rent certainly disrupts the operations of the building, the maintenance, repair, and of course that negatively impacts the rest of the tenants who are wanting pest control to come to spray for roaches, for example. Well, if we don't have that rent coming in, sometimes from a cash flow perspective for an owner, it could be difficult to meet those operational obligations.
Absolutely. So, if you could share a quick one, I know this was we had Stacy. I think she was a tenant in North Hollywood, and she had a lot of difficulty paying rent. And this was one where I think Stacy was trying to play some tricks on us. And maybe you remember the story. You can talk real quickly about, she was falling behind a rent, and like you said, she refused to be on any kind of partial payment. I mean, it's one thing if you're going to be late and cooperative, but she was not. And this was a very tricky situation, or should I say, Stacy was trying to pull tricks on us. And really, that the resistance from her when we had to eventually, pursue eviction, the owner wanted to pursue eviction. She was, filing multiple delaying motions and just driving up legal costs. And in the end, I think you remember this just turned into a cash for keys situation, right? Um,
We had to do something because we recognized early on she was improper. She was basically representing herself in the eviction action, the defense. But she was clever in the sense that either she was utilizing a chat GPT or some sort of free legal tenant defense company because she knew all the tricks of the trade. And she was filing these motions constantly. And I finally had a heart to heart with the owner. I said, listen, if we don't pay her to get out, this is going to cost you more. And either you rather pay her to get out quicker or you're going to pay the lawyer. At some point in time, you're going to have to pay her, but let's stop the bleeding. And so really, thankfully, the owner agreed, and the outcome was as good as it could be under the
Yeah.
circumstances.
Yeah.
But really, one of my favorite parts of this particular story was we started at, I think, $10,000, if I recall correctly, to get her out, within, I think, 3 weeks. And every motion that she filed to delay the case, and she filed a lot of them, cost our clients time and money. We'd have to appear, we'd have to have our lawyers file an opposition to the motion. So every time she played those games, her settlement negotiation that I offered, my settlement offered, would go down by $1,000. And so
Mm,
finally, she realized at $6,000, I wasn't messing around. And so,
yeah.
of course, she ended up settling somewhere around $6,000, but she missed out on getting $10,000 because she was playing those games. But I think the most important thing is, even though she tried to pull those tricks on us, we weren't having any of that. Our job, we have a duty to protect our owners and the properties, and we take that very seriously. And I think that was of course, it cost our client money, but I think it was the best result under the circumstances.
I've forgotten that you had done that. You had said $10,000 and every motion was reduced by that. That's a genius idea. I love that. And so for those watching, like, figure out a way to incorporate something like that, because I think that's a really good scenario way to do it.
Well, also, too, it's a good thing we've done is we've incentivized tenants to move out faster.
Sure.
We'll give them, if they move out within a week, we'll give them a $500 kicker or something like that. Because ultimately, we want to have possession of the property
Right.
and get turned over, and having a paying tenant in there.
Yeah. And so turning from someone who was tricky and kind of pulling all these little games on us, you may remember Andrea. We had a multifamily apartment building in West LA. She fell behind on the on COVID payments and so on, and built up a really large balance. And we'd actually just jumped in and started managing this property. And I remember she was really hostile, very defensive. She was used to the previous owner who had a lot of emotion tied into this property. I think they inherited the building from their grandfather. So there was a lot of emotion tied to the situation. And once we came in, she was like a little, whoa, 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 I'm used to, just dealing with an individual, and wasn't ready yet for the professional management that we offered. But it really turned out to be a benefit to her, because we were really able to like soothe the situation and say, hey, we're not trying to evict you. We're looking for cooperation in this. This can be a win-win for everyone. And I remember we set her up on a payment plan, and she was very responsive, very easy about it. And when it came down to it, she paid off the balance, and it was up to rent, and she was a fantastic tenant. And sometimes I think educating the tenant, saying, hey, this can be a win-win situation. We can turn these tricks into treats, if we're using our Halloween theme here, and really try to work with tenants. That's where you get long-lasting tenants. That's where you get people who want to take care of the community, who feel invested in their community, rather than always feeling that there's this animosity between tenant and ownership.
Yeah, and real quick on that, so we came in the middle of COVID. The owner was quite frustrated by the tenant not paying, and asked for our help. So I remember I personally actually spoke to Andrea as well as people from my staff. And I guess the old adage, the golden rule, do unto others as you wish others to do unto you. And I think this was a perfect example of us just coming out of the gate saying, listen, let's figure out a win-win situation here, a payment plan to make the owner whole, but also to make it digestible for you, that you can afford. She had a special needs child, did not want to be evicted. We actually had COVID restrictions, a moratorium, so we really weren't able to do the evictions at the time. But either way, this was a positive, ultimately a positive outcome, because the owner has been made whole. Otherwise, Andrea has been a good tenant.
Yep, absolutely. All right. So just quick takeaways. What's the right move? So trick or treat. I'll just quickly flash these up. Looking to the left, when we're dealing with a trick, it's usually you've got an uncooperative tenant. When it comes to paying rent, what's the trick or treat? Usually you got an uncooperative tenant. You can assess late fees, serve 3-day notices, and so on. If there's no compliance, you got to escalate this thing and file an eviction, or in some cases, as you talked about earlier, offer the cash for keys and regaining possession and doing that model. I love that. Offering a certain amount, but with every motion that she was going to do, reducing that by a certain percentage.
And sometimes, unfortunately, sometimes you can offer a cash for keys to regain possession, but they won't take it seriously, or they'll drag their feet, tenants, until you actually file an eviction. They're served with the complaints, the
Sure.
eviction. So sometimes, unfortunately, you have to make that cost, that analysis, and actually hire, engage a lawyer to file and serve it on the tenant before the tenant really takes you seriously on that cash for key offer.
Yeah. And then understanding, what's the right move between trick or treat. And in the situation of a treat, Andrea was an otherwise very good tenant. She had a temporary hardship and she was cooperative. She was wanting to do the right thing. And that's why setting her up on a payment plan was really easy because she understood her obligations to ownership and to us. And so we were able to communicate that. And once, we were able to get her on the plan, I think like that was just turned into a really healthy situation for all parties involved.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing too, also some to remember, I think you got a note here is that her current rent, she had to stay up to speed with. Like, if
Yep.
we're talking about the past due balance, her current rent, she had to stay and maintain and cannot have a balance going to the next month. And that was the big thing. We're not going to allow her, she can have a payment plan of her past balance during COVID and play the catch up over time. Whatever, I can't remember what it was, an extra $200 a month till it's paid off. But we need to make sure that her current rent she was able to pay for, and that did not have a balance that went into the next month. Otherwise, her balance would just grow over time. That was something we were not going to accept.
Right. All right. Moving to the next key rule that we have here is respecting the property. So, along with paying rent full on time, tenants have duties and obligations to owners. They need to maintain the property in a reasonably safe condition. They need to dispose of trash properly. They really do need to prevent infestation by not leaving food or garbage out. They need to use the property in a reasonable manner, as a residence, not for a business, not for car washing and doing other kinds of things. They cannot damage the premises, whether it's deliberately or negligently. And they do have a duty to report maintenance issues so that these smaller problems don't become major damages. So I think sometimes we think about, well, what do landlords and property management companies owe? What duties do they owe to tenants? Well, tenants also owe duties to management. And so I think before we start talking about, the tricks and the treats of how to handle tenants, we need to basically understand what are their obligations when it comes to respecting the property.
And I think, Derek, one of the things that we do really well is we train our leasing staff to set these three rule expectations during the leasing process on the onset. It's also listed very clearly in our lease agreements, but we really make it clear from the very beginning that these are our rules for leasing with us. And another thing that we also do is we train our leasing staff to go out and look at the applicant's car. We walk them out from the unit and we take a look at their car. And not because we care about the type of car they drive. We care whether or not the bumper is being held up by duct tape or glue, or if there's McDonald's wrappers thrown throughout the front from the car seat there. And we do so because it's the way tenants treat their cars is fairly indicative of how they're going to treat your property. And tenants, we don't I don't want to go to a property and see cigarette butts laying all over the ground. I don't want to see holes in the drywall from a fist because somebody has punched the wall. I've seen it, believe me, I've seen pretty much everything in my career. Although, I'm always surprised at something new. That's why I love this business. Something always exciting happens. But we want to set the expectations with our tenants that they have a duty themselves. Oftentimes, especially, I think we've done a disservice. The law here in Los Angeles has done a disservice to our tenants, where the tenants are empowered to think that they own the place and they can do
Right.
everything they want to do. And while yes, tenants have more rights here in Los Angeles than in really most other cities in the country. They don't have unfettered ability to do whatever they want to our properties, and it's really our job as the management company to navigate that and to ensure that the tenants are we're communicating clearly the house rules as reflected in the lease. We're clearly communicating our expectations during the move-in process, as well as periodic reminders throughout the relationship. We'll send out, friendly reminders, friendly emails. Please clean up here. Please do this there. And in the event we like that, and usually more often than not, the issue stops right there.
Right.
Sometimes, however, we do have people that take advantage, in which case we have to escalate from a friendly reminder to an actual, maybe a global friendly reminder to all the residents, to a more pinpointed warning to the particular offending tenant. And if that doesn't resolve itself, then of course we're going to have to go to a 3-day notice to cure or quit as it pertains to kind of enforcing these rules and pursuing an eviction action.
Right. So we've talked about tenant obligations. We talked about owners' duties. So let's talk. I know this is one of your favorite examples, and you talk about this quite a bit in your class. And unfortunately, we don't have all the time in the world to tell all the details, because this is a messy, gory story. Maybe next Halloween, Jared, you can get in and talk about this one. But why don't you quickly, as quickly as you can, summarize, what the story was, and how we had to turn this terrifying scenario into, dare I say, maybe a hopeful win for the owner afterwards.
Yeah, this is a tenant of ours in Van Nuys. When she first presented to us, she was well dressed. She was clean cut. She had a job. She moved from the East Coast, so she was gainfully employed. And she paid rent in full on time, respected her property, respected the quiet enjoyment of the neighbors. However, after a year or so, we started getting reports from neighbors that she was at all hours of the night ringing on their doorbell and asking for weird things to charge her phone or what have you. And ultimately, we found out she was on meth, and she was running a brothel, a drug den, as well as a brothel out of her unit. And we had, unfortunately, 2 sets of neighbors had to leave because they felt that their safety was compromised. We spoke to LAPD. They were unfortunately not very helpful, not because LAPD is not helpful, but because the law restricts their ability to help us. We hired private security at a tune of like $35 an hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because she was bringing gang members to the property, and the gangs were tagging the property. So it was slipping really, really fast. So to make a long story short, on Valentine's Day, maybe we should do this a more deep dive on Valentine's. That'll be our Valentine's show. But essentially, we ultimately, part of it was happening during COVID, but at some point in time, COVID lifted the moratorium and allowed us not to evict for payment to quit, but allowed us to evict for private nuisance. She was creating a private nuisance to the property, and that's what we ultimately filed the eviction against her on. And we were able to get her out ultimately by giving her some money to settle. And the irony is we gave her cash because she didn't have 2 forms of ID to cash a cashier's check at a bank. So we gave her cash. We documented everything from videos to photographs of the exchange of the money and signing of the legal documentation. And sure enough, it got word to us the next day. One of the gang members jumped her and stole all the $10,000. But either way, we got her out. We cleaned up the place. We leased it out to a lovely student in the neighborhood, and we cleaned up the building quite nicely as a result.
Yeah, that was, I remember that was a scary situation, and I think we owe flowers to the spouse of our portfolio supervisor, who had to be there that day early on Valentine's Day to handle this, where he could have been with his wife. Instead, he was dealing with the LAPD and everything. So, but I love that you've set up a cliffhanger for the Valentine's Day webinar that we could do. We could go more into this one. Valentine's Day that probably our company would rather forget. So let's talk about tenant treats, since we had a terrible situation on that one. I remember we recently took over a building up in Northridge where it was just really super mismanaged. The tenants were leaving trash everywhere. They were making noise. They were really ignoring standards. And, we could have gone in there, guns ablazing, and start screaming at people. And we realized that like they just had terrible management beforehand. It's like we come in to fix things, and we were coming in to fix a very poorly managed company. I remember the owners was crying to us about this property in Northridge, and we were like, well, this is what we do. We come in, we fix problems. And I remember there was such hostility between the tenants and ownership, and between tenants, that all we really needed to do was share the house rules with the entire community, give friendly reminders, and just talk to people as human beings and say, hey, you wouldn't want this in your house, so why are you doing it into your neighbor's house, and so on. And I remember turning the attitude. Again, it was moving from this antagonistic relationship to one of cooperation. I think it's something that we excel at, is just, hey, and the way to have people cooperate is through clear expectations. And so I think by having a clear structure and communication really resolved things for the entire community, because they were able to respect each other's spaces and not create further damage. I know the rodent issue went away very quickly when people started being responsible for their trash and just not leaving it out in their front door. So
Not only that, we went from an owner who was paying, I think, close to $800 a month in janitorial expenses, going every week or twice a week, I think it was, cleaning the building up, to literally, I think, $300 now a month. So
yeah,
he saved the owner $6,000 a year, or give or take, simply because we went the extra mile, had conversations with the tenants, excuse me, and didn't take it from a stick approach, but like, hey, this is a community-based approach. We've got to figure things out, and taking that extra time to have those conversations really not only benefited the tenants and their community, but also the owner's pocketbook.
100%. Yep. All right. So in sum, when we're dealing with respecting the property, let's talk about trick or treat. When are we seeing tricks? When do we want to use treats? I think in the case of Aspen, Jared, we had someone who was engaged in persistent unlawful activity. We certainly tried friendly reminders, but we had a drug addicted tenant who friendly reminders were really not going to register. We tried the targeted warnings. Then we started losing tenants in that building in Van Nuys because they were just frustrated, and it ultimately turned into an eviction. So when you're dealing with tenants like that, these are the tricks that tenants try to play on us. And so you need to come in using a carrot using the stick rather than a carrot. But as we just talked about, sometimes you have a treat scenario where you can be kind to people when there's nothing unlawful that's happening. You just share house rules, set clear expectations, communicate those expectations, send friendly reminders, and enforce them consistently. I think that's really key, enforcing rules consistently, because I remember this property, they were like, well, how come unit 1 gets to do this and you're not doing this to unit 2? And it's like, you just got to be fair and consistent across the place. And I think that really creates a much more positive living situation if tenants are accountable and we're accountable to tenants. And that, really makes a big difference when it comes to making sure tenants are respecting the property.
Agreed. Yeah.
All right. Our biggest last kind of rule that we have our expectations for tenants is really respecting the neighbors, right? We talked about paying rent for a long time, respecting the properties, and now we're into tenants' duties of respecting their neighbors. So let's talk about what are those expectations that we require. So tenants must respect their neighbors' quiet enjoyment, no excessive noise. It can't be a nuisance to your neighbor. You got to keep noise low, especially during quiet hours. No harassment, no illegal activity that's going to be a threat to the community. You got to respect the common areas. You got to keep clean the common area. You got to keep it uncluttered. That's not only just keeping the property safe, but it's keeping it safe for the tenants. You got to dispose of trash properly and follow recycling rules because, again, not only are rodents a hazard to the building, but it's also kind of gross to the rest of the community. If your building allows pets, tenants got to know they got to clean up after their after their pet, that they have to use leashes from a safety perspective. If they have a dog that's barking, they got to really manage a dog. No barking, excessive barking, especially at night. People do have to sleep. You got to follow parking rules. That's something that we've done before, Jared. I know of setting out parking maps if we have to make sure that we're communicating those parking rules and maps to people. And that tenants guests also have to comply. I mean, how many times have we seen it where, unit one, you're breaking the rule and they say, well, that's not me. That's my cousin that's doing it. I don't care. That's your cousin. That's you, man. You got to take care of that. You're responsible for your guests. So these are the expectations that we have for tenants. Again, they owe duties. They have a duty and a responsibility to their neighbors. Did I miss anything, by the way, in that list?
So no, you hadn't. And I don't know if this is where we're headed, but it's something that I think most owners are not really in tune with. But the duty or the covenant of quiet enjoyment, this is going back to law school days, the duty or the covenant of quiet enjoyment is between tenants themselves, right? So if you're living in unit one, I'm living in unit four, and I'm, doing all the things on the prior list, I'm violating your quiet enjoyment of the property. However, if an owner has knowledge of me or of the tenant behaving this way and sits on his or her hands and the owner doesn't do anything, well, now the owner can be held liable for violation of the quiet enjoyment of the property against the other tenant, the non offending tenant, or the offendee, or the tenant who's complaining of the other tenants violating these rules.
Yeah.
It's really important that owners don't just sit back and say, these are tenant related issues.
Right.
Hash it out. Yeah, I get it. However, if it rises to a level where one of the tenants is really feeling that their quiet enjoyment is being infringed upon, and the owner has knowledge of it, it's really the owner's responsibility to do something about it.
Yeah, you may remember that building in West Hollywood that we managed, where the owner came to us and said, "I feel like I'm my tenant's therapist.
Oh yeah.
I like to manage challenges between therapists." It's like, hold on, you don't need to get into their personal lives, but you do have an obligation to take care of the space. So you don't need them to cry on your shoulder, but you do need to enforce the rules, and you do have obligations of making sure you're consistent in the enforcement of your own rules. So I'm glad you mentioned that when it really comes to owner duties.
Yeah, and I think what owners do is it really comes down to, as you have here, communicating the expectations, right? And put it in writing. I can't stress this enough.
Yeah.
Right? A situation where you said, well, I feel like I'm my tenant's therapist. I remember that owner, and everything was verbal telephonically. And I said, no. We have to do everything in writing, because if the other tenant takes you to court, owner, what are you going to say? Oh, I called, picking the phone. I called the tenant and told him to be quiet in hours. Well, where's documentation, right? So you want to document everything. Text messages are okay if that's your primary form of communication, but you want to screenshot those and save those. Email is better. Written notices are better, with a picture of when you posted it is most ideal. Because ultimately the written documentation is what will ultimately protect you as an owner in court. And of course, if those warnings go not followed by the tenant, then of course you're going to have to issue a 3-day notice to cure or quit. Ultimately, that is something that could cost the owner money, but it shows a judge that you're actually doing something to protect the quiet enjoyment of the tenant who is complaining about it. Obviously, these are more difficult cases to win, because oftentimes it is he said, she said. But if you are documenting, and the tenant who's complaining documents the time, the place, any witnesses, any facts around it, and has kind of a timeline of these infractions, that goes and those are written down contemporaneous to when they actually happen. Those go a long way for documenting these infractions and will be a better suit you for your action in the eviction case. Because ultimately, we want to maintain a safe, peaceful community by, as we mentioned earlier, applying the rules fairly and consistently.
I think that's one thing, and we can borrow from our years of legal being lawyers, is contemporaneous notes are just super critical. Guys, if you've got a tenant situation, keep notes right then and there. Don't say, you know what, I'll wait till next Thursday to start taking notes on this stuff. Keep notes. Time is of the essence. It's really critical that you're documenting things in real time as much as possible. I think that's a really key point to mention. All right. So you may remember this one, Jared. This is when we had a tricky situation where Maria was not respecting her neighbors. She was running an unlicensed daycare. She was creating noise, and so we came in and managed. We took over management of this property, and we found out Maria was running an unlicensed daycare. She was creating noise, safety risk, was breaking the law, super uncooperative. And then Maria was up to tricks, and we had to come in with the rule of law in our hands. You remember this one?
Yeah, I do. I mean, had Maria been running a licensed daycare facility, things may have been a little bit different. The fact that she was doing an unlicensed in a single family home, and we got the phone call from the owner, please help us out. It allowed us to work quickly, and of course, serving a 3-day notice to cure or quit. And ultimately, she vacated short of trial. And the good thing is we were getting a lot of complaints from the neighbors and parking and this and that, random people going in and out. Ultimately, we were able to get the property fixed up and released to a tenant who pays rent in full on time, respects the property, and respects their neighbors. So I remember even getting a phone call from the neighbors thanking us profusely
Yeah.
for taking action.
It's nice when tenants call you and thank you. Property management is often a thankless business, but when it happens, and we get it, at least a couple times a month, it's really nice. It makes us feel good. So this was also, I remember this one, and I thought, whoop, I'm sorry. You may remember John. This was a tenant in Hollywood. John was blasting music late at night, and he was disturbing his neighbors. He was an otherwise good tenant. He was very respectful and courteous, but there was a lot of frustration with the other tenants, and complaints were coming in, and it created tension and everything. And we spoke to John, and we explained to him, hey man, I know you like to listen to music. We all love music, but this is really getting out of hand. And we spoke to him, and I remember he was undiagnosed of hard of hearing. He actually went and got himself checked out. He had no idea that he was being this disrupted. He had zero clue. And when we explained it to him, I mean, he was he was aghast. He's like, oh my God, I didn't know I was being this disrespectful. And when he explained this to the neighbors, I remember the neighbors all chipped in and bought him like a really nice set of Bose headphones as like hey, we want you to enjoy music. Total misunderstanding here. And I think in this situation, really a little empathy solved the problem. Again, we could have come in guns a-blazing. John, you're doing this, John, do that. And we would have been working on information that we were not aware of, and even John himself was not aware of. And I think this is really where empathy solved a big problem. It protected the community. Everyone got along better, and now it's like one of our model properties that everyone just kind of gets along really nicely with each other. So turning what otherwise could have been a scary situation into very much a treat. So what's the right move in when we're dealing with respecting neighbors? Again, when you have a tenant who's breaking the law, in the case of Maria, she had an unlicensed daycare center, the continued pattern, repeated warnings and violation was just doing nothing. When you've got that kind of a situation, guys, you need to bring the strong arm of the law into play and do 3-day notices to cure, quit, or file evictions. But in a case where we had this other property, when there's really nothing unlawful happening. I think it was important that we ask John questions. John, do you know that you're being disruptive? Let's find out a little bit more information. We shared house rules, we set those clear expectations. We talked about communicating those expectations, being clear, sending friendly reminders, enforcing them consistently, and maintaining the property in terms of the community. But also in this situation, when it came to protecting the community, it was a little bit of empathy. I think that really was really powerful, and we converted that situation into a really positive one. So, in sum, tenants must follow lease terms or else violations are going to happen. Again, we can't control tenants, guys. We can only control our response to them. I think it really comes down to we can really influence their behavior. That's all we can really do, as much as we can. When we're dealing with tricky tenants, all right, this is when tenants break the law, they're threatening the health and safety of their community, they're refusing to pay, or they're refusing to compromise, to go on payment plans, whatever it may be, or they're causing ongoing property damage, and particularly if it's in excess of a certain dollar amount. Tenants are always going to cause a little damage to property, but if we're talking in the hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, that's really where you need to really get involved when you're dealing with a tricky tenant. And when disputes arise, and we kind of alluded to this earlier, Jared, when these disputes arise, when we have tricky tenants, that's when good tenants threaten to leave. So you may already have a really difficult tenant who's not paying rent, who's causing damage, but then there's a cascading effect because then your good tenants want to leave. I mean, you talked about that with Aspen. It had such a damaging effect on the rest of the community. When you can deal with tenants, kind of when you've got a treat where you've got an otherwise good tenant. I think we talked about Andrea, who fell behind during the COVID time period. She was an otherwise great tenant, but had a temporary issue that was keeping her from paying rent full on time. And I think if you can have a little empathy, ask questions, set expectations, have clear reminders to people, consistent enforcement against across all tenants. That's where you can really have a treat of a situation. Don't lose an otherwise good tenant for something that can be managed, right? I think that's a really key thing. Ask yourself, is this something that can be managed? We couldn't manage Aspen very well, but she was running a drug ring and a brothel out of her unit. That is over our skis. You can't manage something like that. But in a situation with John or Andrew, where these were situations that I think really could be managed, that's, I think, when we want to bring in a treat scenario. And I think everyone, success is knowing when to spot a trick and when to using a treat. Is that what you would say, Jared?
I think that's fair. I think it's definitely fair. I like this theme of trick or treat you put together. Thank you for that. I would also say too that in terms of setting the right expectations, it's so important both with our clients, our owners, as well as the tenants. We're in the property management business. We manage properties, we manage the relationships of tenants, we manage vendors, manage relationships with the city, et cetera. But we're not magicians, right? So I don't know if that falls anywhere into ghosts and happy.
I thought it did. I knew where you were going with that. I was like, I should have thrown a rabbit in a hat slide in there. But absolutely, we are in the property management business. We are not in the magician business, everyone. So we very much thank you all for attending. If you have questions, if you're interested in how we may be able to help you, please always feel free to reach out to us. You can call us at 888-270-4452 or simply emailing us at info@KIGcapital.com. We are local here in Los Angeles. We get a lot of business from owners whose property management companies are out of city or out of state even. But no, we're local kids here in LA. So we're happy to chat with you about whatever property management things that you may need. And we thank you all very much for attending.
Thank you. I'm just grateful you call us kids.
I know. I still feel like a kid. Very good. Even after being in property management, I still feel like a kid. It's because we're passionate about what we do, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks. Thanks, everyone. Feel free to reach out. We appreciate you attending. Have a wonderful and safe Halloween.